Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Summer of the Silmarils. This is a read-along of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion that I'm doing with David Wiley and Scott Danielson, where we break this book up into 4 parts and read it in the month of July. This is the sort of the stories and myths of Tolkien's legendarium, the legendarium that informs The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And Tolkien never actually did polish it into a finished narrative work. It's very episodic and very uneven, and was made into a book by his son. So the reading experience here is very different than in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, which are designed as stories with beginnings and middles and ends. Although there is still a story in the Silmarillion, and it's hinted at in the title. The Silmarillion is the story of the Silmarils, 3 incredible gems that were made before the sun and the moon were made, and that are astonishingly beautiful, and therefore incite the greed of lots of people who see them. Although, unlike the One Ring in The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarils are not evil. So they don't create greed where none is. They incite it in people who already have it. And the first part of the Silmarillion that we read last time was the purely mythic beginnings of this world. The gods, the Valar, who are originally born of the one god, Eru Ilúvatar, in a void out beyond the world, but then with Eru's help, they create the world and begin to populate it with races. The elves, who are the firstborn of Ilúvatar, men, mortal men, who are the secondborn. There are also dwarves and ents. And into Middle-earth into this world, Varda, this Middle-earth, go not only many of those gods, the Valar, but also one of them who has turned evil, Melkor, who was present along with all the rest of them at the beginning of the creation of this world, but who has always sought to dominate it instead of celebrate it. We're told in the first part that we read that Melkor is the greatest of these beings that Eru Ilúvatar created, but that he has near equals among all the other Valar who go to Middle-earth. And I complained last time that I don't see why he is able to do so much damage when it's just one against dozens. I don't see why these beings all have incredible superpowers just like he does. I don't see why, once they know he's their enemy, they can't just constrain him, but they don't manage to do that. And one of the things that they don't stop him from doing, they create lamps to illuminate Middle-earth, and he destroys them. Then they create trees, 2 towering trees whose leaves, the light of whose leaves, give a gorgeous, beautiful light to the whole of the world. Classic. Leave it to Tolkien to have the world be born of song, first of all, and then to have all the gorgeousness of light come from trees. And also music come from the sea, from seawater. Leave it to him. Those are all Tolkien-esque touches. The Valar create these 2 trees, whose light illuminates the whole world, and Melkor leads a great amorphous, light-eating spider creature, Ungoliant, to the blessed realm of the Valar when I guess they're distracted. I guess they don't put any kind of a guard on the trees or even look in their direction, and manages to kill them. The trees, that is. Ungoliant sucks them dry of all the light that was inside them, and they wither and die. And Ungoliant and Melkor flee. And the Valar don't seem to me to pursue right away, and seem fairly easily thwarted once they do pursue, in a way that you wouldn't expect would be true. We are told that one of the Valar, Orome, specifies in hunting monsters, and yet he seems totally unable to hunt Ungoliant, who's a monster by anybody's reckoning. And there's an uneasy partnership between Ungoliant and Melkor. She eventually decides that since she doesn't really trust him to give her everything that he stole from the elves and from the Valar. The elves are living with the Valar at the time, and in the midst of all of this horror, Melkor steals the Silmarils. In addition to everything else, in addition to a bunch of other gems, he steals the Silmarils, and Ungoliant wants to eat them. And he refuses. He won't give them up, and is only saved from being destroyed by her with the help of his trusty Balrogs, who come to his assistance. And we're going to see Balrogs at the end of this section that we're reading today, just like we saw them at the beginning. Because the point that I want to make there to backtrack a little is that Melkor doesn't just destroy the trees and steal the Silmarils. He also kills King Finwë, who's guarding the Silmarils back home. And that is the first murder of a mortal being that we see in Middle-earth. So those are three things that Melkor does, and then he flees back to his stronghold of Angband. And eventually word comes to the Valar, not only that Melkor destroyed the light of the trees, obviously with the help of some creature that they knew nothing about, but also that he's killed King Finwë. And Finwë's son, Fëanor, is destroyed at that. We're told, I think with a bit of sarcasm, that Fëanor loved his father. Who more loved his father? It's pretty clear by that point in the narrative that Fëanor, who is the creator of the Silmarils, only cares about them, and not really anything else. Not the woman who's unfortunate enough to be his wife, and not his father. But one way or another, the Valar go to Fëanor and say, well, we're grief-stricken, but all is not lost, because the wonder of the Silmarils, the thing that was the glory of Fëanor's creation, is that he captured the light of the trees in the gems of the Silmarils. The Silmarils glow on their own, not just bright in sunlight, but even in darkness. And they glow with the light of the trees themselves. And the Valar go to Fëanor and say, well, if you will give us the Silmarils, we can use them to recreate the light of the trees. And Fëanor refuses. He says, they're mine, and I won't give them to you unless you make me. And if you make me give them to you so that you can, I presume, destroy them, I guess they need to be destroyed in order to revive the trees. If you do that, if you make me do that, well, then I'll definitely know that Melkor is one of you, and that there's nothing that separates the two of you. The Valar give him his way, and he leaves. He takes a large group of elves that are loyal to him and leaves. They leave the blessed realm of the Valar, which is off segregated in the west of the world, and go back to Middle-earth. They take a long exodus to go back to Middle-earth. And that exodus is not easy, because they need ships to cross the water between the land of the Valar and the land of Middle-earth. And they're not great mariners. So they go to the branch of the elves that are great mariners, and that branch wants nothing to do with this business of theirs of going to Middle-earth in wrath, of leaving the paradise, of living with the gods. And instead of taking no for an answer, Fëanor and his sons and their followers kill fellow elves. At the shipyards of Aqualonde, they kill fellow elves in order to steal the ships. It is called the kinslaying, and it brings about the curse of the Valar, who were originally saying to Fëanor and all of his followers, we don't think you should go. It's foolish. You say that you want to conduct war on Melkor, but if that's true, well, he's a Valar just like we are. You can't beat him. So that's foolish. Don't go. But we won't stop you. That's what they had been saying. Once they learned that Fëanor and his people have killed in order to get what they want, then they curse Fëanor, which is quite a different thing. And it's a curse that you can't help but feels a little justified, because there aren't enough ships to carry everybody that's going over to Middle-earth. And once Fëanor and his sons and their immediate followers make the journey, they burn the ships rather than send them back for the rest of the elves who left with Fëanor. Those elves are condemned to go overland through basically what we would call the Arctic. Overland into Middle-earth, a long, cold, bitter, horrible journey on which a number of them die. They're cursed to do that because of Fëanor, who had plans of his own to get to Middle-earth. And the thing that drives Fëanor and his sons, he has 7 sons because Tolkien was a Catholic, which means that he either had 3 sons or he had 7 sons. He could not possibly have 4. If he has 4 sons, or let's say 8 sons, then the devil wins. One way or another, the thing that's driving them is that they take an oath. Once they learn that Melkor has stolen the Silmarils, and, oh yeah, killed Fëanor's father, they don't seem to think about that. Once they learn that Melkor has stolen the Silmarils, they take an oath. It's the oath that creates the story of the sons of Fëanor. And I want to read that oath to you. Tolkien doesn't give us the oath, instead he paraphrases it. Then Fëanor swore a terrible oath. His 7 sons leapt straightway to his side and took the selfsame vow together and red as blood shone their drawn swords in the glare of the torches. They swore an oath which none shall break, and none should take, by the name even of Iluvatar, calling the everlasting dark upon them if they kept it not. And Manwë they named in witness, and Varda, and the hallowed mountain of Tanaquetil, vowing to pursue with vengeance and hatred to the ends of the world, Valar, demon, elf, or man, as yet unborn, or any creature, great or small, good or evil, the time should bring forth unto the end of days, whoso should hold, or take, or keep a Silmaril from their possession. And that is a horrible oath. That is the sons of Fëanor swearing themselves to reclaiming these 3 gems. But the key in the horrible oath, the oath is horrible anyway, to swear by Eru Ilúvatar, I mean, really. But the key thing in there that makes it horrible, I think, is that mention of good or evil. That means that it's all about the lure of the Silmarils and has nothing to do with the aim, with the reason why anyone would take the Silmarils. The sons of Fëanor are taking an oath to kill good people, if those good people happen to come across the Silmarils. That can't lead but to harm, and that is coupled with the curse of the Valar, so that you know for sure that none of the sons of Fëanor are going to come to any good end. And maybe none of the elves that voluntarily leave the blessed company of the Valar will come to good ends. One group of elves does turn back before they've gone on any kind of road, and they are welcomed back. But the rest of them, you think they're going to come to ill. In other words, this second chapter, this second section that we're reading, begins to introduce darkness. There's hardly any light anywhere in here. There is, most especially, none of the light comic relief that is all throughout The Hobbit and that the Hobbits themselves provide in The Lord of the Rings. Instead, this is high Old Testament Book of Samuel drama. And you just have to get used to that. You have to make your peace with that, because that's not going to change. Tolkien, in fact, elaborates something of the philosophy that governs the way he thinks about these things. He writes, "But of bliss and glad life there is little to be said before it ends. As works fair and wonderful, while still they endure for eyes to see, are their own record. And only when they are in peril or broken forever do they pass into song." So you kind of know from that the theme of what you're going to get here. And the story goes on. There are a few digressions here in these chapters that we're reading today. We see, for instance, the founding of a couple of hidden cities. The elves, once they get to Middle-earth, even though they create a league of siege around Angband and seem to have Melkor contained, most of them don't believe that's going to last forever. So they start to fence off hidden kingdoms like Gondolin, or the realm that's encircled by the supernatural being Melian. She's married to an elf king, Thingol, but she herself is not an elf. She is more along the lines of what Gandalf might be, or Saruman. And supernaturally fences off their kingdom from outside interference, unless that interference is borne on the kingdom by someone more powerful than she is. It's kind of a force field. We see that. We see smaller stories. There's a little story about a dark elf who is presented as a complex character, not just a one-dimensional villain. And his story is fairly fascinating too. But mainly this is the story of Fëanor, who no sooner gets to Middle-earth, for all that he's done, the kinslaying of Aqualonde, the stranding, the ship burning, all of that, for all that he's done, he no sooner gets to Middle-earth than he dies. He and his forces are confronted by the forces of Angband, of Melkor. Melkor sends out a small detachment of forces, and they are overwhelmed, almost annihilated, and then driven to flight by Fëanor and his sons. And Fëanor is, we're told, an extremely passionate individual. That his passion is his downfall. It carries him away. And it does. In a scene that comes very early on. Fëanor and his sons have not been in Middle-earth very long. When we get this scene where the enemies, the servants of Melkor, are fleeing before the forces of Fëanor. And Melkor doesn't know that. But Tolkien tells us that if he did, he might not be grieved, because he would know the sequel. Yet cause he had for great joy, though it was hidden for him for a while. For Fëanor, in his wrath against the enemy, would not halt, but pressed on behind the remnant of the orcs, thinking so to come at Morgoth himself. And he laughed aloud as he wielded his sword, rejoicing that he had dared the wrath of the Valar and the evils of the road, and he might see the hour of his vengeance. Nothing did he know of Angband or the great strength of defense that Morgoth had so swiftly prepared, but even had he known it, it would not have deterred him, for he was fey, consumed by the flame of his own wrath. Thus it was that he drew far ahead of the van of his host, and seeing this, the servants of Morgoth turned to bay, and there issued from Angband Balrogs to aid them. There upon the confines of Dor Daedaroth in the land of Morgoth, Feanor was surrounded, with few friends about him. Long he fought on, and undismayed, though he was wrapped in fire and wounded with many wounds. But at long last he was smitten to the ground by Gothmog, the lord of Balrogs, whom Ecthelion after slew in Gondolin. There he would have perished, had not his sons in that moment come up in force to his aid, and the Balrogs left him and departed to Angband. That little mention there, for he was fey, consumed by the flame of his own wrath, is great Tolkien. There's a lot of great Tolkien in here, but that scene also reminds us of something that Tolkien has told us a few times in these chapters, which is that these elves are fresh from their creation. They have not been around for thousands of years. They have an enormous amount of the mystical power that was imbued to them at the beginning, and it's burning as life energy rather than immortality, rather than hanging on. Tolkien tells us that in these early years, these early ages, they seemed much more like men in the vigor of their frame, in the violence of their passion. And you can tell in this scene because Feanor fights with Balrogs, not one, but multiple Balrogs alone, for a long time before he's overcome. When, it literally kills Gandalf to fight just the one. But like I said, that consumed in the flame of his own wrath, that is wonderful, and we get passages of beautiful prose like that at many points in the Silmarillion. That is one of the reasons to keep reading this book, even if you're a little bit dismayed by the pace or the tone of the narrative. The tone of the narrative is very Old Testament and low, and so it came to pass, and so it was, and vocal mannerisms like that crop up often in these pages, and they were anachronistic when Tolkien was writing them. In today's day and age, they're virtually an alien language. And I have a passage that sort of underlines that. I want to give you just a bit of this. Tolkien fans won't think anything of this. But imagine for a minute encountering something like this if this was the first time that you were reading this book. But Turgon remembered the city set upon a hill, Tirion the fair with its tower and tree, and he found not what he sought, but returned to Nevrast and sat in peace in Vinyamar by the shores of the sea. And in the next year Ulmo himself appeared to him, and bade him go forth again alone into the vale of Sirion. And Turgon went forth, and by the guidance of Ulmo he discovered the hidden vale of Tumladen in the encircling mountains, in the midst of which there was a hill of stone. On this he spoke to no one as yet, but returned once more to Nevrast, and there began in secret councils to devise the plan of a city after the manner of Tirion upon Tuna, for which his heart yearned in exile. Now, I'm laughing, but I'm not mocking. That is, in fact, a solemn and meaningful moment. That is the moment that Turgon decides to create the hidden city of Gondolin, which will have a great narrative of its own in the upcoming chapters that we'll be reading. But passages like that, to put it in the friendliest way possible, that makes tough going for the reader. That is tough going for the reader. And the passages like that occur all over the place in this book. So you're going to have to, as I said last time, you're going to have to be prepared for that. Because that doesn't change. You just have to take this book on its own terms. There are only a couple of points in the entirety of this book where you get something approaching a coherent, modern-style narrative. Turambar, Beren and Luthien. There are only a handful of stories. We're getting to them. We'll get to them. And they are routinely viewed, they're routinely described by Silmarillion fans as the highlights of the book. I myself don't think so. Once I got into the Old Testament sing-songy rhythm that I just described there, I loved it all, including some of the minor stories that aren't as big as Beren and Luthien, that aren't as coherent. And that they aren't coherent for a very good reason, because all of the characters here are immortal. They all live forever. So a story can stretch out over many centuries, and have many beats of drama, here and there interspersed over centuries. It's actually a fairly good way of describing what drama would be like in a world that's largely populated by immortal beings. Once I got used to it, I liked that. But the key that I want to point out for the sections that we're reading today is the echoing involved. Feanor hates Melkor, the Satan of the story, the evil, the bad guy. Feanor doesn't like him any more than the Valar do. It's just Feanor isn't aware of how much influence Melkor is having on him. We're told that when Feanor is trying to rouse his compatriot elves to flee the paradise of the Valar, he's, unbeknownst to him, repeating things that are lies created by Melkor specifically to sow dissent among the elves. But that Feanor repeats those lies believing that he believes them, not knowing that he's been fed propaganda. He turns Melkor away from his door, face to face. Tells him to get away from him, to get gone. Never has anything but contempt for him, and actually dies chasing his enemies all the way to Angband, hoping, we can assume, that once he reached Melkor's stronghold, he would kill Melkor. That he would somehow overcome the defenses of Angband and meet Melkor in single combat. We're going to see how well that turns out in a later story. Not with Feanor, because Feanor dies of his wounds. His sons come up to save him in that passage that I read, but it's too late. He's already dying. And when he dies, he is so fiery a spirit that his body is consumed to ashes. It's not like there's a dead body left behind for Feanor. But the thing that I wanted to point out is the echoing involved here. Because Melkor does a series of things, right? He does a series of things. He defies the Valar. He commits murder. He kills someone. He does this out of a monomaniacal lust for the Silmarils, and he flees to Middle-earth. And Feanor does every one of those things. He defies the Valar to the point where they finally curse him. He flees from paradise. He goes to Middle-earth. He covets the Silmarils to the point where he's willing to make a binding oath on not only himself, but everyone involved with him, including his own sons. And that kind of mirroring, I don't believe, is accidental. Feanor might hate Melkor, but he is totally enthralled to this figure of evil, and ends up echoing all of his behaviors. He lusts after the Silmarils. He's willing to shed elven blood on their behalf, basically, on their behalf. He's willing to defy the Valar even though they curse him. He's willing to flee to Middle-earth with violence in his heart. It can't end well. And that is the tapestry that we're getting here. If you're reading this for the first time, you might be a little surprised by that. The tone here is dark. It's gloomy. That will only be slightly alleviated in the chapters that we're coming up to. But nevertheless, I still think there's a great deal of beauty involved here. You just have to take it on Tolkien's own terms. And he stated his terms, right? That passage that I read you. That there's no point in writing heroic stories about the good times when truth and beauty and noble people are enjoying themselves. So he will pass over in these pages, in a single line or even less than a paragraph, he'll pass over centuries of contented happiness. Because as far as he's concerned, the story begins when those things are either broken or endangered. We're going to get a lot of breaking and endangering in the upcoming months. So in these upcoming chapters, so that is it for today. These next we'll be reading, I think, the next 8 chapters of the Quinta Silmarillion. And I will leave links to Scott and David so that you can catch up on their thoughts as well. And we'll all reconvene next week and continue on with the Silmarillion. So until then, I'm going to wrap this up. But I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.